the National Council for Jewish Women decided it would be useful to have one Shabbat a year that would be focused specifically on reproductive rights. Jewish people in general, and Jewish women specifically, tend to be very pro-choice. Something like 85 or 90% of Jewish voters vote in a pro-choice direction, and for many of them it's a voting caliber issue. They decide their vote one way or the other based on that concern. They chose a Shabbat that's technically next week. We don't have one scheduled that week, so we're doing it a little bit earlier. But they chose it based on the particular Torah portion that includes a passage that impinges, that bears on the issue of abortion. And we'll have a chance to look at that passage in just a moment. But part of our challenge in looking at this source is what's near it and what's next to it. Because after all, even if this source provides something that we'd like to see, there's plenty of things that we don't like right next door. So we're going to take a quick look at the beginning of this Torah portion. It's called Mishpatim. These are the rules, Ela HaMishpatim, that you will put before them. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, the person shall serve for 6 years and go free on the 7th year. So already we have an acceptance, a modification of slavery. If he came single, he leaves single. If he has a wife, she leaves with him. But if the master gave him a wife and she has borne him children, the wife and children belong to the master, and he shall leave alone. But if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, I do not wish to go free, his master will take him before God, bring him to the door or the doorpost, and he shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he will remain his master's slave for life. How progressive. When a parent sells a daughter as a slave, she shall not go free. Is this a document of women's rights? If she proves to be displeasing to her master, who designated her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. And if he has designated her for a son, he will deal with her as is the practice with free maidens. How nice. And yet, in verse 12, it begins to turn. One who fatally strikes another party shall be put to death. An eye for an eye, a life for a life. If a man did so, but not by design, it was an accident, it was manslaughter, I will assign to you a place to which he can flee. If one party schemes against another and kills through treachery, you take him from my very altar to be put to death. There is no safe place if it was part of a premeditated plan. One who strikes one's father or mother shall be put to death. One who kidnaps another party shall be put to death. One who insults one's mother or father, well, maybe that law could use some modification, at least for my household. When two parties quarrel and one strikes the other with stone or fist and the victim does not die but has to take to bed, if that victim gets up and walks out on a stroll, the assailant goes unpunished except for paying for the idleness and the cure. So there is some monetary compensation for the injury. If a slave-owning party strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod, who dies there and then, this must be avenged, a life for a life. But if the victim survives a day or two, this is not to be avenged, since they are the other's property. Ugh. And then here's the verse that the point was. This is why this was chosen for Reproductive Rights Shabbat. When two or more parties fight, and one of them pushes a pregnant woman, and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact, the payment to be based on a reckoning or calculation. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Now, what are the implications of that key section, starting with verse 22? When they fight and one pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage, there is a fine. Well, if the fetus was a full person, it would have been a life for a life, right? It's not here. It's damage of some kind. It's not nothing, but it's not everything. So the status of the fetus is implied here as being something less than a full person. I'll also point out that the pregnancy is assumed to be in the context of a marriage, right? Who is the one who sets the fine? It's her husband, not her. After all, this is focusing on the father's rights, but the mother's rights, what she thinks, the damages she feels from this, maybe he takes it into account, maybe he doesn't, but it's not about her. It's about him. And this also highlights the fact that there are degrees of harm, that it's not entirely black or white. After all, the woman herself may have faced some damage, some bruising, even a long-term consequence, and that is to be considered as well. Now, the National Council for Jewish Women, I don't want to make fun of them. That's not the point. In fact, the fact that they are raising awareness of the issues of reproductive rights and emphasizing their roots in Jewish law is valuable and important. They provide a whole set of resources, including passages like this, or other passages in the Talmud that highlight the fact that rabbis once said that if a pregnancy is lost under 40 days, it's like water passing. It's just not significant. That first 40-day period is like nothing happened. They also point out that if the fetus is directly threatening the life of the mother, imagine in a breech birth or some other kind of problematic birth scenario, you can treat that fetus as if they were a murderer trying to kill her. If her life is in danger because of the fetus, you're allowed to kill the potential murderer, to even do what's called a craniotomy, to collapse the skull of that fetus to be able to evacuate it to save the life of the mother. Now, in that scenario, you could say that the fetus maybe is of equal status. After all, this is on the point of birth in this case. But you're allowed to kill them because they're a pursuer. They're in that legal category. But there are some other rabbis, including Rashi, who's a famous rabbi living in the 11th century in France, who said that actually the fetus has less than full status. It doesn't have a full soul until it's actually emerged from the birth canal. Maimonides, on the other hand, almost contemporaneous to Rashi, said, no, it is a full being by that time at 9 months plus. That's enough. That's a full being, but it's the pursuer category that enables. But in either case, the life of the mother, the well-being of the mother, is an important factor in ancient rabbinic law. This is not in the 1950s. This is in the 1050s, in the 1150s, that they're considering these as factors. And in general, terminating a pregnancy for health reasons for the mother is accepted in traditional Jewish sources and, of course, across the modern Jewish denominations. But there are two problems with only focusing on Jewish sources as the basis for reproductive rights. As we saw in the book of Exodus, there are plenty of other statements in these same sources that we reject. And it's less convincing when you're ignoring some of the rules and celebrating the ones that you already agree with. Sounds like you're cherry-picking the ones you like, and we do that sometimes. We find a nice reflection of our values in the past. But to say we're doing this, we're advocating for reproductive rights because it's in the Torah, well, that's not fully why we're doing this. And after all, this very different basis for allowing some abortions means that the ability to terminate a pregnancy is not a basic right. It's special permission. Only under these circumstances are you able to do this. So there's no such thing as a none of your business abortion. There's no such thing as the medicinal or morning after pill abortion. And there's inevitably a debate over what really counts as saving the life of the mother. How far along, or how bad does it have to be to save her health or well-being? These are the debates that are taking place right now in states that have put in exceptions to those bans. And just imagine if U.S. law followed Jewish law. That would not be the reproductive freedom that advocates want. It's similar to contraception. In Jewish life, there is permission for contraception if it's for the health of the mother. But there's other valuable principles in rabbinic law of be fruitful and multiply. Do not spill the man's seed in vain. Well, that limits your options for contraception, but it also is not the kind of freedom of sexual practice and use of contraception that we would value in the 21st century. So it says be fruitful and multiply. And I thought of a parallel to this, thinking of fruit, because last week we celebrated Tu B'Shvat. You might have noticed it was a full moon out, 15th of the Jewish month. It was the holiday of first fruits of the spring, but also the New Year for trees. Today it's celebrated as Jewish Earth Day. Tu B'Shvat is a time for environmental awareness and activism, a time to connect to fruit and trees and the natural world, which is all fine. But that's not where Tu B'Shvat started. Tu B'Shvat started as a mystical practice. And even before then, it was the Jewish New Year for trees, so you could tax them appropriately, because they were tax exempt the first 2 years of bearing fruit, and the third year you took a tithe of the fruit. Well, you need to know how old the trees are, and nobody keeps track of tree birthdays. So you pick a date in the calendar, and that's the date all the trees are 1 year older. Okay. Now, there are far fewer Jews who were raised Reform or Conservative or Reconstructionist or Humanistic in the 70s and 80s who had ever celebrated Tu B'Shvat. I never remember doing anything for Tu B'Shvat growing up in a humanistic congregation. Today, it's just about everywhere. And what that reflects is not some kind of internal Jewish development. It's the external value of environmentalism, of conservation, a secularization of the mystical concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world. Otherwise, Jews would have invented recycling centuries ago. But they didn't. We weren't environmentalists until everybody was environmentalists, and now we wanted to find a Jewish connection, a hook for that environmentalism, and we found it in our calendar with Tu B'Shvat. Well, the same is true with modern values around reproductive freedom for women and abortion rights for all those who have reproductive capacity. They may have some parallels to be found in Jewish legal discussion, but it's really a product of modern feminism in the broader society of the last century or so. It was only 1965, less than 60 years ago, that Griswold versus Connecticut was ruled on by the Supreme Court, which claimed a right to privacy implicit in various amendments of the Constitution. Some saw it in the prohibition against unreasonable search and seizure, others saw it in the guarantee of due process, an implied right of privacy, at least for married couples. After all, that decision was only for married couples. It was another several years before contraception was available for anybody. And there were other rulings that became based on this concept of a right to privacy, including Roe versus Wade in 1973, Lawrence versus Texas in 2003, which was the law that prohibited banning sodomy, whatever that meant, but often applied to gay couples, and other rulings based on privacy. Now, the abortion rights approach that we saw at the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st was also the result of this social revolution that asserted women's rights as individuals. And in fact, it asserted their rights as individuals surpassed their traditional role as mothers. So they were allowed to have reproductive choice even beyond just contraception and preventing pregnancy in the first place. Abortion was already legal in 17 states by 1973 when the Roe decision was brought down. By comparison, in 1967, when the decision of Loving versus Virginia was enacted, which allowed for interracial marriage across all 50 states, there were still 17 states banning interracial marriage in 1967. So Roe versus Wade was on the way, and interracial marriage was on the way out, but there was still plenty to go in both directions when those decisions were taken. And you might or might not realize that the last de jure legislation banning interracial marriage was finally stricken from a state constitution in Alabama in the year 2000. It took a long time. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I consciously chose not to go to law school. So others could give a better explanation of the legal arguments behind these Supreme Court decisions, behind the legislation being passed in various states, by the future court challenges on the horizon. And I'm an amateur historian beyond Jewish history, so there are also better accounts of the evolution of abortion law from the 19th century forward than I can provide. From what I understand, it was definitely practiced outside of the medical establishment throughout the 19th century, but with the development of a real medical establishment, they wanted to centralize health care, and it often took it away from midwives and other people who had been acting to help women with pregnancy in either direction, either forward or to terminate it. Now, we also understand that the laws began to be imposed more restrictively in the middle of the 19th century and after the Civil War. And we certainly had a period of over 100 years of the hypocrisy of doctors being willing to do privately for those who had money these procedures, while the poor had to go to dangerous amateurs, these so-called backyard, back alley abortions. By the 1950s, the casualty rate was actually down to a few hundred deaths a year. Before then, it had been a few thousand deaths a year, but the invention of antibiotics actually saved many lives. Still, a few hundred deaths a year is still terrible, and that's what was reported, of course. And it does not count the people hospitalized, the people severely injured, the people made infertile, and simply the trauma of what was involved in going through, not to mention the social stigma of going away to the grandparents for 2 weeks and coming back. Now, we understand, in traditional Jewish law, whoever saves a life, it's as if they've saved the entire world. So even one death from a procedure that could be done safely is a tragedy. And that's where we want to talk today, is the ethics of the abortion issue. When does a potential life become a full life? If you've decided that this is a case of the pursuer pursuing the mother's life, even if it's her mental well-being, her economic standing, the welfare of her family more broadly, where is your line? Or is it up to you to draw the line? In Roe versus Wade, they created a trimester system, where the first trimester was allowed, the second trimester was a maybe, and the third trimester, or the point of viability, whatever that has meant, and that's changed over time, those were the lines. But of course, there's no strict lines in the development of a fetus, and in every pregnancy it's going to be a little bit different. So this is part of the challenge in using law to define these things, but it's also a challenge in ethics, because we think of ethics as a system that applies to everybody. But who am I to apply my values to you, especially on such a personal issue? In the end, the challenge of the ethics of abortion debate is that we have fundamentally irreconcilable differences in a worldview. There's a famous quote attributed to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, "You're entitled to your opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts." When it comes to when does a full life start, when does the soul appear, there are different facts, because there are no facts. I mean, it's both opinion and belief, and there's no way to resolve the issue like how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin. If an embryo is really a person, then it requires action. On the other hand, if the embryo is not a person, up to a certain point, then leave me alone to deal with the cells that are in my body. This is the balancing act. And this is why it's hard to find common ground, because there's this irreconcilable difference. Now, even if we grant the embryo a status of a full life or mostly a full life, consider this analogy. I first heard this in a religious ethics class 25 years ago. You go to sleep one night, and you wake up the next day attached to someone else. It's a world-class violinist whose fans have decided that their life is worth saving, and so they've gassed you overnight to knock you out, and they've hooked you up to a life-sharing machine where your organs are supporting the life of this other person. Now the question becomes, are you allowed to unhook yourself? Do you see a parallel with the abortion issue? Certainly in the case of rape or incest or contraceptive failure. You didn't choose to have this happen, and now this other life is dependent on you without your consent. Are you allowed ethically, morally, to reclaim your life and to make your own choices? Now that's in the case of a world-famous violinist who's clearly a person. Add the ambiguities of the early stages of pregnancy, you begin to see that maybe it isn't in the outside power's decision-making capacity to enforce the life support life on someone else. In the end, we are faced with the dilemma of legislation and personal choices. There's that famous bumper sticker, if you don't like an abortion, then don't have one. But it's the challenge of freedom, the individual versus the group, and groups versus other groups. Right now in Missouri, there's a legal case that's been filed against the abortion bans there by several rabbis and a couple of ministers, saying that our religious freedom to enable women to have abortions to save their life and health is being restricted by your imposition of your religious ideology on these individuals. And sometimes that's a successful strategy. It was tried during the gay marriage battles of the early 2000s, and maybe it will bear some fruit now in an era where the court does seem to be looking kindly on religious freedom arguments, at least some religious freedom arguments. We also anticipate future consequences. We're consequentialists after all. We make ethical decisions based on the impact in the world. We do know that bans will mean more difficulty, more challenges for people. We're certainly grateful for the option of medication-based abortion, if that's possible, and that makes people safer and able to make their choices in a safe way, then that's all to the best to save lives. But we know that attacking this right to privacy leads to other freedoms being threatened. There's a reason why Congress, in a bipartisan way, passed a law legalizing same-sex and interracial marriage, because they were afraid that that right to privacy basis for so many other laws was under attack. I also wonder, is it really going to be the case that people will be able to restrain themselves and leave the momentous issue of defining a person to individual states to make their choice willy-nilly, just like what their income tax rate is? I'm not so sure. There will be future cases that try to impose a national standard. There may even be attempts to pass a federal ban on abortion, or some kinds of abortion, or abortion after a certain period of time. And there may be other freedoms under threat too. After all, if a state wants to ban mail-order medication-based abortion, how are they going to enforce that? They're going to snoop. Maybe interstate travel is under threat. After all, if you leave pregnant and come back not, how am I going to know if you left pregnant? Well, now I have cause for a warrant on your blood or others. Well, even our personal communication might be at risk. There was a case just recently where Facebook messages between a mother and daughter were subpoenaed by a court because it was evidence in the commission of a crime. She was helping her daughter get a medication abortion. And if it's a crime, then the privacy of those communications is also up for grabs. It's a scary world that we're living in and that we could be moving forward towards in this new world post-Dobbs. So what do we do? There has to be something we can do. Well, there are things we can do. We are fortunate here in the Chicago area to be living in a sanctuary state. It's not the Underground Railroad quite yet. But we are a place for people in surrounding states who cannot exercise that reproductive freedom to come here and do so. And actually, clinics have opened up across the border, all around the ring of state borders, across from St. Louis and in the south as well, near Kentucky. I don't know if they're going to put up tourist billboards about it, but it has certainly been a result. And the same is true in North Carolina, as an island of reproductive freedom there. Even people from Alabama and Georgia are going to Florida. With all of its restrictions, it's more flexible than those states. So there will be these islands in a sea of bans and restriction. The second is, we can put our money where our values are. There is something called the National Network of Abortion Funds. You don't have to post on Facebook saying if somebody wants to go fishing or take a vacation, they can stay with you. You can support funds designed to help people who need help to exercise this basic right. For many people, it's become a primary voting issue for increasing numbers of voters, including for young ones. In fact, for some, it's even been a deciding factor in applying to colleges. I know a few students who changed their list of schools they would apply for based on whether they would have reproductive freedom in those states where they were in college. There are people who are more comfortable sharing stories from the pre-Roe period, or to share stories about what late-term abortion is really about, why their abortion was a positive step in their life, why it was not taken lightly or casually, but also why it was an important part of their life's journey. And perhaps most important is that you can start paying attention to this issue. I recently heard on NPR an interview with the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, which recently has had many of their legal rights curtailed by the state legislature, who wants to appoint judges rather than let the people of Jackson vote for it themselves. And the mayor says this is based on racial animus, and he actually quoted the football coach Dennis Green, who used to be coach of the Arizona Cardinals. In a very famous meltdown after a loss, he just ranted and ranted at the podium, "They are who we thought they were." In this case, he was talking about football. But in Jackson, and maybe in this case in dealing with the abortion issue, they are who we thought they were. People have been saying they want to ban abortion, and guess what? When in power, when able to appoint Supreme Court justices, when able to pass state laws, they're doing it. There's even a passage in our Torah portion that talks about that. In Exodus 21, if you have an ox that was known to gore people, and you let it out and it gored someone, it's still your fault. These oxes are goring all over the country. It's not a surprise. So if we pay attention, we realize they are who we thought they were, and we have to be whom we need to be. Last and most important, our humanistic Judaism celebrates the dignity of the individual. We have our responsibilities when part of a community, but we also have the right to be in charge of our own lives, to believe and say what we know to be true. We have the right to act on what we know to be right. The reproductive freedom that we wish for our world and for ourselves may not be entirely found in the Jewish tradition, but it is square and center in a humanistic approach to life and society. The very next chapter in Exodus 22, it says, "Do not oppress the strangers, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt." If each of us wants the freedom to run our own lives, then every one of us needs that freedom to make our own choices and to live our own truths. I'm sure there are a lot of thoughts, opinions, reactions to the situation in which we find ourselves and to the challenges of facing the decline and the rollback of these rights. And so I'd like to ask if you have any comments or thoughts or reactions that you feel free to jump in. I'm going to switch back to our gallery view and ask if anyone online would like to add any thoughts, or if anyone here would like to, I can pass around the microphone.
I'm curious, when you read the laws from the Torah, and it seemed to put a lot of emphasis on the mother's rights and protecting the mother, calling the embryo a pursuer and such.
That's more rabbinic than Torah.
More rabbinic. Do you know the biblical roots of why the Christian community seems to be so fanatical about putting an embryo's life before that of a mother or a 10-year-old child who's been raped, etc.?
So part of the challenge is that while this has been part of, you can just hold on for a second, it's been part of Catholic dogma for quite a long time. It wasn't always a Protestant concept, the idea that the soul was enshrined with conception. But it became so as they were looking for common cause and there's all kinds of studies about the socioeconomic and political, even racial background to the anti-abortion movement and the trends it took since the 1970s, where many Protestant denominations, in fact, were open to legalization of abortion in some way, even if they may have been anti-feminist, but then it turned in different directions. In terms of the biblical basis in the Christian Old Testament and their understanding of it, my understanding is that they find certain passages that seem to talk about the beginning of life, or I was with you at the beginning, and they'll focus on those kind of passages, particularly in the prophets and in the New Testament, that seem to suggest that there's something unique that happens when the child is conceived. I don't know the exact quotation lines they're using. I'm sure they would be happy to share them with you. If you go onto any one of those websites, you'll find the biblical basis for opposing abortion. I'm sure there are lots of opportunities to explore that more. Yeah, Larry.
Something that I've been uncomfortable with, the argument, it's my body and I'm going to control it, is exactly the argument that was used by people that didn't want to be forced to take a COVID vaccination or to wear a face mask in public, even though statistically they were a danger to others, which I don't see as being different than abortion.
Well, the danger to others is where you might make a distinction. If the fetus is, not a full person yet, then that's what's endangered, and it's not the same as endangering a full life person. But absolutely, this was a case where that rhetoric was deployed in opposite directions. I mean, people will also point out that many of those who are pro-life are opposed to pre-maternal care through public health services, or post-maternal care through public health services, or public schools, or free preschool, or any of the support for women and children, those kind of things. So pro-life lasts up to the OBGYN visit, and then you're done. But this is part of the challenge, that people will deploy rhetoric that they don't always mean, or that it applies in different circumstances. So if somebody says, my body, my choice, you don't know if they're talking about abortion or about vaccinations. Where we can make a distinction, I would say, is that the abortion issue really does affect the individual involved, where a herd immunity phenomenon, or the fact that you can be contagious to others, does affect others. Look, you can make the argument about smoking. Most smoking has been banned in indoor places, not because you're not allowed to give yourself lung cancer, it's because you're not allowed to give the waitress and the stewardess and your compatriots in whatever room you're in lung cancer. It's the effect on other people. So the vaccines is like smoking, I would say, more so than it is like abortion.
In following this issue, it just seems to me that I'm not sure they're really talking about fetal life or when life begins. I really do feel like they're attacking women's rights to live their own lives, not even to control their fertility and even to engage in sex when they want to. I mean, it feels to me like slut shaming, that it's really not about, that they're disguising the issue. Because when you try to talk about contraception, they get upset too. And I'm casting a wide they net, but I'm just saying this is how it's been feeling to me. And I wonder if anyone else has been sensing that.
Well, there have been those who object to the human papillomavirus vaccine, which is a sexually transmitted disease that you can get vaccinated for when you're 9 years old. And people have said, no, you shouldn't do that because that's what God wants to happen. You should have a consequence for having sex. I mean, this is the people who thought AIDS was God's judgment. That it's consistent, at least in its awfulness. And part of the challenge with the abortion issue as it comes to women's lives is precisely that. It's other people telling you what you can do with yourself. And it's not an accident that the feminist movement produced this kind of backlash that is often played out on women's bodies, and abortion rights is one of those cases where there's progress when women are making progress, and there's retrogression when gender roles are up in the air and people are being reactive against them. I mean, again, I don't think it's an accident that with all the dialogue we're having now about, are trans men men, or are they women, or are trans women women or not, and how do we define those who are able to give birth, whatever that category might mean. The fact that that is in evolution in a very public and even legal way has led to people trying to clamp back down and to reimpose those conventional categories. I actually was reading just before our service tonight a study that was done in the 1980s comparing pro-life women and pro-choice women. And they found they were very different demographically, where pro-life women had gotten married younger, they had had more kids, they had not necessarily worked outside of the house, or if they had, in a minimal way. Most of them were stay-at-home mothers, where the pro-choice women were professionally educated with graduate degrees, who had fewer kids, had married later, or had not married at all. And they saw themselves as women and their roles as women very differently. They even they couldn't agree on the term for what to call the surprise pregnancy. Was it a surprise pregnancy or was it an unwanted pregnancy? The pro-life women didn't like the phrase unwanted pregnancy because from their perspective it was a surprise, but it's what's supposed to happen. It's part of the divine plan for their lives. Obviously the pro-choice women were less likely to go to church, the pro-life women were more likely to go to church. I mean, all these demographics were very different, but it often mapped out into their sense of what it meant to be a woman in their own lives. And I think even though that study was done 40 years ago, there's still some element to that socioeconomic self-definition role for those pro-life women. This is one of those cases where people don't realize that about 40% of women are pro-life and about 40% of men are pro-choice. So it's not a men versus women issue because there are pro-choice men and there are pro-life women. There are plenty of senators right now that you would not want to be the people deciding abortion policy because they're Republican women who are pro-life from pro-life states. So we have to realize as a society, or as those who see this as an important issue, that it's not an us versus them in the gender line, it's an us versus them in the progress line, in the individual autonomy line, in some other way of dividing the debate.
Before I get into what I was going to say, just a side comment. I think that if more people realized that boys can get HPV and that HPV results in cancer, they would not be as vehement in their being against the HPV vaccine. So, and as someone who had HPV before they knew it was caused by a virus and did a lot of research on it, it was a surprise to find out that boys could get it. And people do not realize that. But that's not what I wanted to comment on. You talk about what we can do, but there's this situation in Texas with this federal judge who was due to give a judgment today, but postponed it to the 27th as to whether the so-called abortion pill would be legal, and his judgment would apply across the United States. And this is a pill that was approved over 20 years ago and has been deemed safe and safer, using the two pills together, safer than just the one that they're not going to ban. And it makes, as a 70-year-old woman who was around when the fight for the pill for abortion, as well as the birth control pill, was part of my childhood, it's really disturbing because I don't know what I, as an individual, can do to affect the situation, to persuade people to, once a federal judge deems that this is illegal across the country, and yes, it'll have to go through the courts and end up in the Supreme Court, it makes you feel really pessimistic about the country and really depressed. That's all I got to say.
Yes. Sheila, please.
Two issues, I think. First of all, abortion is only a part of the gender war on bodily autonomy. And I think we've seen that in the Florida attempt to get information about young women's menstrual cycles in athletics.
Which is being canceled.
There was pushback, but
Right.
that they didn't try. And you don't see bans on Viagra, for instance, and you don't see required vasectomies in certain situations, for instance. So I would say, regardless of the statistics, there is a significant gender bias. Secondly, both the Society for Humanistic Judaism and particularly Jews for a Secular Democracy see the abortion issue as the breakdown of the wall between church and state, because it is a religious issue, and I hope the clergy in Missouri do bring that up, because that's a sword that cuts both ways.
Yeah. So another concern is the safety of being pregnant in the United States. Does this mean that a woman should be careful when she's pregnant as to whether or not she should travel to a state that doesn't have the proper medical care if something should go wrong with her pregnancy? And women have died because of sepsis, or because of basically the water breaking, ectopic, all kinds of reasons that could cause a woman to die. And a woman who's on a baby boom, this is even outside the country. In Malta, it turns out Malta does not permit abortion. So it has no way of saving the life of a woman who needs one for medical reasons. They had to helicopter her out of the country and get her to the nearest emergency hospital that could treat her. Mm-hmm. What would happen, I think eventually what will happen is that somebody who's not in a marginalized class, who's not poor or a person of color, is going to die, and it'll probably be somebody of a high-ranking politician. And at that point, that's what has to happen for all of a sudden for people to change their tune. It's pathetic.
And we're already seeing it in the states that have exceptions for the health or life of the mother, but how bad does it have to be before they're willing to do it? And people are actually being allowed to get worse and worse to the point that they're on life support, and then we can intervene. I mean, it's appalling. It's really appalling that what people think of as a kind option or making this available is in fact causing people to suffer even more. In the end, these exceptions prove to be as cruel as the bans in some way. And it does put people's life at risk. People don't realize that pregnancy is a life-risking opportunity, an experience, even if it can have wonderful results. There are real dangers involved in it. And so forcing people to do it, if they don't want to, or if it was the result of rape or incest or other kinds of terrible circumstances, is a cruelty on top of cruelty and making them put their lives at risk when they don't have to. Well, I'm sorry to end on a down note. I don't like to do that. But sometimes a down note is what we need to be motivated to move forward and to act and to try to avoid harm. After all, all those rules about putting to death those people who kill other people or providing the opportunity for revenge, in the end was designed to prevent people from doing terrible things. So if you're motivated by this to go out and vote, or to go out and be an activist, or to go out and give money, or to go out and simply share your voice on this issue to those who might listen, it's absolutely worth it.